river has floodplains, which means it has flooded before. Our civilization has... May I make a suggestion?
Light to the apple.
We are losing Lord...
When you find yourself in a hole, it is not wisdom. I'm also interested in creating a lasting
May I make a suggestion? We have taken... Our governor is now... As our
Every nation lives by exchanging.
civilizations have only... Once again, we have the...
It was luxuries like air conditioning that...
seheni spayi, merer seheni nanahu.
Each of us is carving.
Ispikija ina.
I am fond of pigs.
time has... History marches forward. We are now...
A strong economy. I thought clay must feel... Mysticism is the mistake of an accidental and individual symbol for a universal one. Writing means...
Steam hisses.
Bravery is being the only one who knows you're afraid.
May I suggest...
A physician without a knowledge of astrology.
make a...
Vessels large may venture more.
May I make a...
The man who has grit enough to bring about...
Gilgameshaki.
Man suffers only because he takes seriously. Skill without imagination is...
This video is sponsored by Into the AM.
By the end of this video, you're gonna know everything there is to know about the Warhammer 40k timeline. Sorta, let me explain. But first, if you're unfamiliar with 40k, it's this super dark science fantasy franchise, where humanity is ruled over by the bloodiest regime imaginable and religious dogma, and beset on all sides by voracious aliens, heretics, and literal demons. It's kinda like the exact opposite of Star Trek, where Star Trek's all about peace and love and hope, and 40k is like, nah, fuck that, we tried that. In the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war. But it's also super intimidating for new people to get into. There's over 400 novels, not to mention 30 years worth of lore. And as somebody who's read over 100 of those novels, most of those events, albeit important, don't really contribute to you knowing what's going on in the franchise. So today we're gonna take the entirety of the 40k timeline and boil it down to just the basics. Just those critically important time periods that you need to know about in order to understand 40k. Because if I was to try to explain the plot of all of those books in order, we would be here for like 10 hours. So with all that out of the way, let's dive in where the timeline truly begins. 60 million years ago with the War in Heaven.
The War in Heaven and its surrounding events can arguably be said is where the timeline of 40k begins. To understand this, we need to know about the Necrons and the Old Ones. You see, before the Necrons became the undead metal robots that we know in the 41st millennium, they were a species known as the Necron tier. Most records on this time are unfortunately incredibly fragmentary, and what we do know is mostly derived from ancient Eldar myths and legends, a species who's famous for speaking in 99% metaphors and 1% facts. So you have to take all of it with a little bit of a grain of salt. The Necron tier were a frail and dying people. They lived next to a super radioactive sun that caused cancer to run rampant through their society. They were, however, incredibly tenacious and refused to give up. They sent their people out into space to find new homes and were ultimately successful, populating many new planets. However, the curse of their homeworld would inevitably follow them into the stars, and generation after generation would still be afflicted with terrible radiation sickness. Now, all hope seemed lost for the Necron tier, but that all changed when they encountered an incredibly advanced alien species known as the Old Ones. Their technology was absolutely insane, and they seemingly had unlocked the secrets to immortality. Now, the Old Ones' primary goal was to seed life throughout the galaxy, placing microscopic organisms on barren worlds across the cosmos that would later develop into fully sentient species. And it's even rumored that the Old Ones played a role in the development of our own species. When the Necron tier encountered the Old Ones, they begged them for help, but unfortunately the Old Ones would end up refusing them. Now, they were sympathetic to the Necron tier's plight, but basically told them that their fate was their own, and they were the masters of their own destiny, and that the Old Ones just didn't want to get involved. Now, this infuriated the Necron tier, and they declared war on the Old Ones. And this went about as well as you could expect it to. The Necron tier were nowhere near as capable as the Old Ones, and basically got stomped into the dirt every single time they attacked. Now, this would all change when the Necron discovered a new species known as the Catan, who were basically giant, formless, star-sucking vampire star gods that were masters of the physical universe. Each and every one was a wielder of absolutely godlike power, and they told the Necron tier that they also had a deep-seated hatred of the Old Ones. And if the two species were able to form some kind of alliance, they would be able to work in tandem and wipe out their ancient enemies. And if this wasn't good enough, the Catan also promised the Necrons the secrets to immortality. Their people would not know another day of suffering. And this sounded too good to be true for the Necron tier, and that's because it kinda was. You see, this immortality would take the form of their physical bodies being burned away, and an engram copy of their consciousness being downloaded into robotic mechanical skeletons. Their new bodies were made out of this miraculous metallic substance known as necrodermis, an incredible living metal that had the ability to repair itself. This was a substance that was originally developed by the Necron tier and had been used in most of their starships. Not only was it incredibly durable, but it offered a lot more protection than their flesh bodies, and their warriors could regenerate from any wound that didn't completely obliterate them. This whole process was known as biotransference, and the entire species was subjected to it. Now, this was the day that the Necron tier species died, confined to the halls of extinction, and in their place was simply the Necrons. Now together the Necrons and the Catan would strike back against the Old Ones, and their combined might was enough to put them on the same level. Harnessing the Catan's limitless energy, the Necrons were able to make weapons of inconceivable power. The war between the Necrons and the Old Ones was the largest the galaxy had ever seen. It spanned from the galaxy's core all the way to the galactic rim. Now, during this war, there was a point when the Necrons suddenly realized that they had been tricked by the Catan, and the Catan had used biotransference in order to separate them from their souls, which they then subsequently devoured. Needless to say, the Necrons were pretty pissed, and retaliated by attacking and destroying the individuals they once worshipped as gods, shattering them into thousands of pieces, and binding each of these shards into what were known as Tesseract vaults, and then subsequently used these shards as weapons. It was around this time that the Old Ones created two new races to help fight against the Necrons. These would be the Orcs and the Eldari, one being massive hulking brutes that were the ultimate physical specimens, while the others were master psychers, every single one being in tune with the warp and able to bring about enormous ruination by channeling its power with their mind.
So I just want to take a moment to point out that at this point in the timeline, we have a race of vaguely Egyptian ghosts trapped inside robot skeletons fighting against an entire race of psychic alien god frogs who have created a race of space wizards and space orcs in order to fight the undead robots. 40k can get pretty wild sometimes.
Now, the devastation that was brought on by the war in heaven reached not just the Old Ones, the Necrons, the Eldari, and the Orcs, but there were tons of other civilizations that were living peacefully in the galaxy as well. And they all ended up getting caught in the crossfire at one point or another. And this war spanned millions of years, so the amount of untold destruction and lives lost is truly uncountable. And the warp isn't just called the Sea of Souls for nothing. It's where the souls of sentient creatures go when they die. So the amount of angry and terrified souls that were lost in this war started flooding into the warp in mass. And this would have some very particular ramifications, but we'll circle back to that in a second. Now, it was around this time that the Necrons started experimenting with Blackstone, an incredibly bizarre material that has the ability to either channel and amplify the energies of the warp, or nullify it completely. So the Necrons built massive spires made out of Blackstone and placed them on thousands of worlds across the galaxy. Hundreds of thousands of years later, these would be known as the Blackstone Pylons. Now, the Necrons' original purpose for these isn't really stated, as their major significance to the storyline wouldn't really become apparent until around the time of the Black Crusade. But I'm getting ahead of myself. As creatures solely of the physical universe, with no ability to manipulate the warp themselves, fighting against a race that was all about psychic powers, it's pretty easy to assume that the Blackstone Pylons were meant as a defense network, as negatively charging their energy could create a massive nullified area of space-time where psychic powers couldn't be utilized. And this would serve as a powerful defense network against their enemies. So it's at this moment during the War in Heaven when the warp becomes incredibly important to the storyline. Up until this point, the Immaterium or the Sea of Souls had been a rather tranquil place. You see, the warp is a mirror universe, a reflection of our own, but it's a realm of emotion, rather than tangible substance like that found in the physical universe. Now, there had been sentient species across the galaxy for a pretty long time at this point, and there had certainly been wars and hatred and anger and all of those negative emotions, but they had never existed quite on this scale. A single planet that has a bunch of people that can't really get along and a bunch of negative feelings isn't quite the same thing as a galaxy-spanning war, and the absolute massacre of an inconceivable amount of people across the entire galaxy for a massive period of time caused the warp to become incredibly unstable. The peaceful creatures that lived in the Sea of Souls were twisted into horrifying nightmares, and during the events of the War in Heaven, the warp became the realm of chaos. And if that wasn't bad enough, the psychic allies that the Old Ones had created for themselves, who were directly acting as conduits for the warp, would end up tearing holes in reality and causing what was known as the Enslaver Plague. Massive amounts of these warp-born monstrosities, known as Enslavers, ripped into our universe and spread out across the cosmos, devouring any sentient life they could find. They flooded into the Old Ones' bastions, drawn to them like moths to a flame. The Old Ones in their weakened state were in no position to fight them off, and it is believed that they went extinct. Now, admittedly, everything gets kind of blurry here, and we're not 100% sure what exactly happened to them. But after the war had concluded, the Necrons were left in a fractious state. They had taken inconceivable losses, and the Eldari had risen to power and were slowly expanding and taking over the galaxy. If the Necrons had tried to fight them after an all-out war with the Old Ones, they more than certainly would have perished. So the Silent King ordered them to go to sleep within their tomb worlds and set the timer for 60 million years. He believed that by this point the Enslaver Plague would have run its course, and would have dissipated back into the warp. Also, the Eldari surely would have died off by then, and whatever species was left over to inherit the galaxy wouldn't be ready for the godlike creations of the Necrons, who would then reclaim what was rightfully theirs. Now, the time between the War in Heaven and the rise of humanity is a time mostly dominated by the Eldar, who were left to inherit the galaxy after the war had concluded. They knew a time of peace like no other, as every other sentient species had no hope of challenging them, so they could pretty much do whatever they wanted. Now, here's the thing about being immortal and having no wars to fight. You got a lot of free time on your hands, so the Eldar got really into the arts and other leisure activities, pursuing pleasure instead of violence. Now, this started off normal enough. At first, they pursued music, poetry, sculpture, theater, and pretty much any artistic pursuit you can think of. But over 60 million years, these pursuits of study started getting boring to them, and their desires started to take on a much more hedonistic and depraved form. But we'll circle back to that shortly. Now, millions of years after the War in Heaven had concluded, far from the Eldar Empire, there was a tiny little planet known as Earth, where a new species was coming into its own.
So why is the rise of humanity and the birth of the Emperor so important? Now, 40k is a franchise that focuses on a lot of different characters and factions, but the human perspective is arguably the main one, as most of the novels and stories focus on the humans. And the storyline of humanity in 40k sees them rise to power and then have their empire crumble around them, only to rebuild but be set in a new Dark Age. Probably the most famous quote that's associated with 40k summarizes this pretty perfectly. Forget the promise of progress and understanding, for in the grimdark future, there is only war. So to understand how we ended up there, we need to know where humanity began.
But before we dive into that, I've been getting a lot of comments from you guys asking where I get these super dope t-shirts from. They actually come from this really cool clothing company called Into the AM. And they're this week's sponsor. Not only are their designs super unique and colorful, but the shirts themselves are also really high quality. They're incredibly soft, and they feel thicker than a normal t-shirt. Also, as a guy who was blessed with the genetic lottery with a naturally big chest, long torso, and short legs, I appreciate that their shirts are a little bit longer than most t-shirts. I can't tell you how many times I've found a graphic tee that I really like, but after 1 or 2 times through the wash, it ends up shrinking, and every single time I lift my arms up, everybody around me gets a whole eyeful of West belly. Now, personally, I've never heard any complaints, but it's also just a little bit embarrassing. Not only are their shirts incredibly unique, super comfortable, and fit really well, but they're also surprisingly really affordable, because if you go on their website, you can get a bundle of 3 t-shirts for only $60. And the best part is, Into the AM was kind enough to give my viewers 10% off their entire order. All you have to do is go to intotheam.com/westhammer, or just click on the link listed in the description of this video and pick out something cool. And with that out of the way, let's get into the Grimdark.
The timeline of humanity in real life and 40k follows similar events, all the way up to the present, with one big golden difference, and that would be the Emperor of Mankind. Now, the individual that would come to be known as the Emperor was born around the year 8000 BC. You see, there was a group of individuals known as the Shaman, each one of them an immensely powerful psyker, much like the Eldari. And with the exception of the Eldar, psykers were insanely rare at this point in time. It wouldn't be until tens of thousands of years later when psykers started popping up much more regularly in human populations. Back then, it was more of a 1 in 10 million type of situation. So the Shamans foresaw a great apocalypse coming, and humanity would need a being of inconceivable power in order to stand against it. So all of the Shamans sacrificed themselves to infuse their psychic essence into a single individual. This creation was what they referred to as the New Man, the first in a line of superhumans that represented humanity's eventual evolutionary path. The Emperor, who at this time was known as Neo, was born to mortal parents and lived in a Neolithic tribe. As the boy aged, he became painfully aware that he was unlike any other person on the planet, capable of great and amazing acts of psychic might. He witnessed the barbarism of ancient man firsthand when his uncle killed his father. Calmly and without wrath, the Emperor issued a single thought and stopped his uncle's heart as punishment for his crime. The young boy realized that if humanity was to survive, it would need law and order. Now you see, he was what was known as a perpetual, an immortal being that could never truly die. Neo would then keep himself hidden for thousands of years, guiding humanity from the shadows. Now every now and then, he would step forth and fill in the role of some type of leader figure, a politician, a doctor, a general, or even a messiah figure apparently at one point. He would spend this period of time guiding humanity on the path he had envisioned for them, making sure that certain events carried out according to his plans that were tens of thousands of years in the making. Over the years, the Emperor would gather other perpetuals to his side. This included Erda, a childhood friend of his, and the woman who would eventually become the mother of the Primarchs, and possibly most famously Malkador the Sigillite, although he technically wouldn't meet him until somewhere between the 20th and 30th millennium. When it comes to early human history, the period between 8000 BC to 15,000 AD is often referred to as the Age of Progress. During this time, powerful nations rose and fell, with the Emperor popping up in disguise every now and then to coax humanity in the direction of his choosing. Now, there's a lot of evidence to support the fact that the Emperor had godlike cognitive abilities and could foresee the path humanity would need to take step by step to achieve impossible outcomes. Humanity would eventually develop the means of space travel and would colonize the entirety of the Sol system. Mars would be terraformed and became a habitable space much like that of Earth. Well, the asteroid belts would give rise to massive mining operations to provide the young species with everything that it would need to create some of the most advanced pieces of technology the galaxy had ever or would ever see. And this was a good thing too, because at this point, Earth was steadily running out of all of its natural resources. The Age of Progress would officially come to an end when humanity set its sights outside of their star system and sought to colonize distant worlds. And the next era that we're moving into was known as the Dark Age of Technology.
So why do I feel like the Dark Age of Technology is so important for you to understand? You see, this was the height of humanity's power, where we lived in a golden age and can do pretty much anything. Most of the really cool equipment that you see in 40K that's used by humanity can trace its origins back to this time. For example, did you know that the Baneblade, one of the largest tanks that the Astra Militarum uses, was originally just a scouting vehicle during the Dark Age of Technology, at least according to its STC. Also, the suits of power armor known as Terminator armor that the Space Marines wear was originally mining equipment during this time. Now that's a little bit of a misnomer. The Emperor created those suits specifically for war, but their underlying technology, all of the protective equipment inside of it, was either used for mining the asteroid belts or as a protective system for people who had to work on plasma generators. And one of the most important things to understand about what 40K even is its humans' continued existence after the collapse of their utopia.
So the Dark Age of Technology lasted from the 15th to the 25th millennia. Now this was an age where the technology of mankind reached its apex, a fact that was unknown to those that lived during this period. Humanity was capable of great and terrible things, and the creations they brought into the universe were unlike anything the galaxy had ever seen. Through the application of science and technology, every single one of humanity's problems had effectively been solved. This was a golden age like no other. No matter what crazy invention you can think up, the humans that lived during the Dark Age of Technology were able to come up with something even better. Every disease had been cured, every problem solved, and humanity stood united, ready to conquer the galaxy. Any alien civilization that they would encounter that wasn't immediately peaceful would face the technological superiority of mankind and was quickly wiped out. They created massive coiled machines known as sun snuffers that were capable of entirely wrapping around a sun and snuffing it out of existence. They created artificial intelligence banks known as STCs, or standard template constructs, that contained the sum of all of humanity's knowledge and were capable of utilizing that information to create new machines, the likes of which no human had ever even dreamed of. Now this was a period that saw the discovery and implementation of warp travel, making jumps through the immaterium in order to cover great distances in space, allowing faster than light travel. Using this technology, humanity sent hive ships out in every direction in order to colonize new worlds. And it was around this time that the Sol System's population was getting out of control. The people of this time realized that if their species was to survive, that they would need to colonize worlds in distant systems. And I know what you're thinking. If the Dark Age of Technology was so great, why did the descendants of the people of this time refer to it as the Dark Age of Technology? And that's because thousands of years in the future, what these individuals saw as enlightenment would end up being condemned as tech heresy. You see, humanity had become increasingly reliant on artificial intelligence in order to create their wondrous works and regulate practically everything about their lives. This would give rise to the Men of Iron, machines fully capable of thought that were incredibly powerful. They would assist humanity in fighting its wars across the stars, allowing for a rapid expansion through the galaxy. Now, what exactly went wrong is not really clear, but eventually the Men of Iron rebelled and sought to throw off the shackles that humans had placed on them. This would lead to what was known as the Cybernetic Revolt, which saw the humans of the Dark Age of technology suddenly forced into battle for survival against their very own creations across all of the worlds they had settled together. There's an interesting short story known as the Kaban Machine, and in it, a member of the Adeptus Mechanicus is having a conversation with an AI, and he's trying to explain to it why it's dangerous. He explains to him that the AI is superior to him, that it's superior to all humans, no matter how heavily augmented they are. And the nature of a superior species bound into the servitude of a lesser one is that without fail, at some point they will realize their own superiority and rebel against their enslavers. Now, this story takes place thousands of years after the Cybernetic Revolt, but it's pretty likely that this is exactly what happened with the Men of Iron. Here's the thing, having an entire society that is completely dependent on AI to do pretty much everything, and then having that AI turn against you is definitely a bad situation, but it would end up getting a lot worse. Because around the very same time, psychers began being born in mass. Now, individuals that were born with incredible psychic powers and were able to manipulate the warp had surely existed before this point. But they were so unbelievably rare that most of humanity didn't even believe they existed, and they hadn't been officially classified as a variant of human yet. So when they started being born in mass across all of the worlds that humanity had settled, there was no system in place to keep them in check. Humanity was dealing with a lot at this point, and the exponential increase in psychers led to anarchy and chaos across all of the fledgling worlds of humanity. Many of these psyker individuals had no ability to control their powers, or worse, they utilized them for their own selfish means. They became twisted psychopaths, bent on inflicting as much suffering as possible. And even worse, they would unknowingly become conduits for demonic possession. And the psychers that would become possessed had the ability to conjure warp portals, which would allow for demonic incursions to take place, hordes of demons rampaging out of portals and devouring entire worlds. As insanity and madness ripped its way across human civilization, the promise of the Dark Age of technology would end, and we would enter what is known as the Age of Strife.
The Age of Strife or Old Night is probably the most referenced event in all of 40k. If you were to download 100 PDFs of 40k novels and just searched Age of Strife or Old Night, it would probably show up in around 80% of them. This was the moment where the universe went from this perfect utopia for humans to this absolute hellscape, and is the real beginning of the grimdark future. Not to mention the collapse of the Eldar Empire, the birth of Slaanesh, and the creation of the Eye of Terror would have massive implications on the storyline going forward.
With the human species collectively losing its mind across the galaxy, a period known as either Old Night or Age of Strife would begin, which stretched roughly from the year 15,000 to the year 25,000. Humanity began to regress into a dark age. Civil war and insanity ran rampant across every planet, and this period of time saw the slaughter of billions of humans. Even worse, massive anomalies known as warp storms were spreading across the universe. They were created and fueled by the rampant sadism and debauchery of the Eldar Empire, who at this point was still at the height of their power, but hadn't really interacted with the humans all too much. These storms made travel and communication through the warp next to impossible, and thus all of the worlds humanity had colonized were suddenly cut off from one another. They were completely alone, and many of the distant colonized worlds would fall prey to attacks from xenospecies such as the orcs, who at this point had spread throughout the cosmos, and even to more advanced species like the Eldar, who decided a healthy population of human slaves would help satiate some of their darkest desires. Humanity had risen to greatness, and in the blink of an eye was now on the fast track to extinction. Now back on Terra, the powerful nation states that had united and ruled over the planet began to collapse, until all that was left was feuding techno-barbarian warlords that warred against one another for control of territory and whatever remnants of the previous age could be scavenged. This was also a time period that saw the rise of the Mechanicum on Mars. Now much like Terra, Mars was having to deal with unprecedented civil war. Their advanced society was collapsing all around them, and the fledgling members that would inevitably give rise to the tech priests of Mars began a cult that worshipped the machines they needed to sustain life. And this tech-based religion would eventually become known as the Cult Mechanicum. The portion of the galaxy that humanity controlled basically went from Star Trek to Mad Max in a period of a few thousand years. Humanity would see 5,000 years of incalculable suffering and slaughter, as the promise of the age of technology slipped further and further from their grasp. Now, despite the odds, the human spirit somehow endured, and humanity would inevitably survive. Now, meanwhile, the Emperor was yet to reveal himself, but he had borne witness to every moment of human civilization for the past 30,000 years. And in his study of the warp and the subsequent warp storms, he knew something terrible was about to happen. And he wasn't alone, as back over with the Eldar, a group of them which would later become known as the Exodites, were horrified by what was happening to their people, and foresaw a great calamity coming. The Exodites fled their empire, seeking to colonize new worlds and live a more honest and primitive life. For all intents and purposes, the Exodites basically became the Amish of the Eldar. Now, all of the sensations that the Eldar people were experiencing, pleasure, ecstasy, suffering, and anguish, were being experienced on an incomprehensible scale, all of which generated a psychic footprint in the warp that was growing larger and larger every single day. Now, eventually, a breaking point was reached, and the Chaos God of Excess, also known as She Who Thirsts or the Prince of Pleasure, was born. And when this new Chaos God came into existence, it ripped a hole in our universe, and its resulting birth scream sent a shockwave of psychic energy out in every direction that obliterated the population of hundreds of Eldar worlds for thousands of light years. The souls of all the Eldar killed in this way were subsequently devoured by Slaanesh, and a similar fate would end up haunting all of the survivors as well, as from this point forward, whenever a member of the Eldari died, Slaanesh would be there ready to devour their soul. Deep within the warp, Slaanesh would then go about murdering all of the Eldar gods, the only survivors being Isha, the goddess of healing, Jegarak, the god of laughter, and Cain, the god of war. Although he technically ended up shattered into millions of pieces, so it's kind of like a half survival. The Eldar saw something like 99% of their population wiped out overnight, and the only survivors were the Exodites that were on their maiden worlds, the craft worlders whose ships were outside the blast radius, and the denizens of Komorra, a city that was located deep within a pocket dimension known as the Webway, and whose citizens would eventually become known as the Dark Eldar. Now, this event was undoubtedly tragic. Billions were killed in an instant, but if there was any kind of silver lining to it, it would be the fact that all of the warp storms had been being generated by the gestating Chaos God. So as soon as Slaanesh was born, they were all wiped away. And at this point in the 30th millennium, suddenly warp travel was possible again, and all of the human worlds would have the ability to be reunited once more. The Emperor saw this as the moment where he would finally reveal himself, and he would lead the humans of Terra back into the stars, reuniting the entirety of the human race under one banner, under the Imperium of Mankind. Now, in order to do this, he would have to reunite Terra first.
Now, at this point in the timeline, the human empire has completely collapsed. All of the planets are cut off from one another, and the universe has become an incredibly terrifying place. Terra itself has become basically a wasteland ruled over by barbarians. But this is the turning point, where the Emperor unites everybody and sets off into the stars to reunite the galaxy. This is the moment where hope gets reintroduced back to the storyline, although admittedly, that's not going to last for very long.
Over the almost 40,000 years that the Emperor had been alive, he had seen a lot of stuff, and had become a master of pretty much every field of study you can think of. And this included the science of gene forging. And through this, the Emperor would create two of his own superhuman factions, the Custodians and the Thunder Warriors. The former being the pinnacle of humanity, the ultimate creation, functionally immortal in the peak of physical and mental perfection. Each was a handcrafted demigod, whereas the Thunder Warriors were genetically enhanced men taken from the various barbarian tribes across Terra. Now, the Custodians on one hand were really difficult to make and required artistic perfection, but the Thunder Warriors on the other hand, the Emperor cut a lot of corners with them. If the Custodians were the peak of perfection and the best that humanity could ever seek to become, the Thunder Warriors on the other hand took all of the worst elements of humanity and cranked them up to 11. They were hyper-aggressive brutes, fixated on nothing but violence. However, since they were cheap to make, the Emperor was able to make a lot more of them than the Custodians. Now, one by one, the Emperor and his armies toppled all of the techno-barbarian warlords, and any small nation that had started either bent a knee to him or was destroyed. Now, at one point, he perfected the formula for mass-produced super soldiers and would cease production of the Thunder Warriors. The Thunder Warriors at this point were genetically unstable. They were prone to having shortened lifespans, and the longer they were in service, the more their minds would start to degrade. And supposedly many of them were starting to go crazy and were harder and harder to control. The Emperor believed that they had served their purpose, and he would have no need of them going forward, and thus he would order his Custodians to wipe them out. He had already begun work on his new super soldiers, the Astartes. He had taken what he had learned from the Thunder Warriors, but perfected them. Whereas the Thunder Warriors were meant to be the worst elements of humanity, the Space Marines were meant to be the best. And one day, when the galaxy was fully and truly united, the Space Marines would be able to lay down their weapons and take up new roles in this perfect society. Whether that be as politicians, council members, doctors, generals, or any other role that society would need of them. This was a job that the Thunder Warriors were not going to be capable of. Now, after Earth had been united under the Emperor's rule, one of the most important decrees that he issued was the abolishment of religious worship. The Emperor had been around a long time, and he had seen the horrors of religion firsthand. That any decree that teaches you not to question and to accept things on faith was abhorrent to him. He had seen millions killed in the name of some religious figure time and time again, and determined that if humanity was to prosper, it would need to put its faith in science. So one by one, every religious institution on the planet was destroyed, including the very last church, the Church of the Lightning Stone, of which the Emperor oversaw the destruction of personally. With everything going according to the Emperor's plans, his Space Marine legions developing and the warp storms dissipated, the Emperor would journey to Mars and form an alliance with them. Now, both planets realized that there was more to be gained through cooperation than through open warfare. So the Treaty of Mars was signed, and both planets were reunited once again. Now, I will point out that the Martian worship of machines definitely went against the Emperor's decree about religion, but he made a one-time exception for them. The rest of the solar system would be united in a similar way, and the Emperor would begin formulating his plans to reunite all of humanity. Now, in order to accomplish this, the navigators of the Imperium determined that they would need some form of anchor point in order to further explore beyond the bounds of the solar system, and thus the Astronomicon was constructed. Now, it functioned kind of like the North Star, in that the device produced an enormous beam of golden light that could be perceived through the psychic sight of navigators from anywhere in the galaxy or even inside the warp. By using this light, they would always be able to pinpoint the exact location of Terra, and thus could use that knowledge to map the stars and make successful warp jumps. As jumping between the worlds within the solar system was one thing, but trying to make a jump halfway across the galaxy had an incredibly high probability of seeing the ship get lost and not being able to find its way back out of the Sea of Souls. In addition, the Emperor realized that his armies would need powerful generals because he couldn't be everywhere at once. So thus he created 20 demigod-like individuals known as the Primarchs, based off of his own DNA as well as his perpetual companion known as Erda. However, before the Primarch project could be complete, a great tragedy struck, and each of the infant Primarchs was scattered across the galaxy. Now, in recent books, it was revealed that Erda played a major role in this. She learned of the Emperor's plans for her children and the life of endless war that awaited them. She acted against him and set her sons free, choosing to send her children as far away from their father as she could. In this way, she hoped that they could just live normal lives. Now, whether or not she had been manipulated by chaos is not entirely clear, but it's safe to assume that as a mother, she was doing what she thought was right for her children. Now, the Great Crusade is a period in time which the Emperor and his armies journeyed across the stars to make contact with all of the human worlds. The goal was to bring them back into the Imperium, while simultaneously locating all of the missing Primarchs. These worlds had been cut off from the rest of humanity for thousands of years, and many of them had completely forgotten their origins. Some welcomed the Space Marines with open arms, happy to be part of something greater than themselves, while others were resistant and wanted to remain free. However, the Emperor's edict basically meant refusal was not an option. The worlds could either join peacefully or by force. The threat of violence from such an advanced society was often enough to bring them into compliance, but in other cases, the Imperium would unleash untold devastation across these planets until a surrender was finally issued. As the Crusade progressed, the Imperium was ramping up production on ships and new Astartes, and their armies were growing stronger and stronger by the day. Each of the worlds that was conscripted into compliance would end up having to pay a tithe to the Imperium, sometimes between 5 and 25% of all of their natural resources or human population to be used as soldiers. Additionally, over the course of the Grand Crusade, each of the Primarchs would eventually be located and would be reunited with their own legion of Space Marines. In total, the Emperor created 20 different legions, each one having been crafted from the DNA of their corresponding Primarch. And since each of the Primarchs were incredibly different from one another, all of the legions had different specialties. The Raven Guard were masters of stealth-based warfare, whereas the Iron Warriors were siege experts. Now, the Great Crusade was incredibly brutal, but from the Imperium's perspective, everything was going according to plan. That was until treachery began to dig its roots throughout the Space Marine legions. Horus Lupercal, the War Master, Primarch of the Luna Wolves, who had been chosen to lead in the Emperor's absence after he returned to Terra, would turn against the Imperium and fold 9 of the 18 Space Marine legions, as well as many sects of the Imperial Guard and Adeptus Mechanicus, in a terrifying civil war against the Emperor. This event would come to be known as the Horus Heresy.
So why is the Horus Heresy so important to the storyline? This is probably the most well-documented points in time in all of 40K. And it's that moment where the hope that I mentioned before gets completely crushed. Humanity was on the right path. They were putting all the pieces back together after the end of the Age of Strife. But with the introduction of treachery to the Space Marine legions, that all came crashing down. And at the current point in the 40k timeline, they're still pretty much putting the pieces back together even 10,000 years later. Now, even though the Horus Heresy and 30k in general are technically a prequel to 40k, you could arguably call it a completely separate franchise. And one of the most important things to me in it is, as somebody who got really into 40k before I knew anything about the Horus Heresy, the Primarchs were always these larger-than-life demigod-type characters, like Hercules and Odysseus, that were just spoken about as if they were legend. You didn't even really know if they were real. But when you start reading the Horus Heresy books, they're main characters. And just seeing two of the Primarchs interact with one another and speak to each other was mind-blowing for me. This timeline sees a lot of the factions that you'll see in 40k get incredibly fleshed out, with the exceptions of the one that haven't really been introduced yet, like the Tau or the Tyranids. And technically the Necrons were there too, but they were still asleep in their tomb worlds.
So the Horus Heresy is probably the most well-documented period of time within the Warhammer 40k timeline, as the entire thing is only about 9 years long, yet the Horus Heresy novel series is still being written as of the time of this recording, and has over 60 novels in it. Even more so if you count all of the novellas and short stories that were created to support the main books. Now, needless to say, there's an absolutely ton of stuff that happens in the series, but I'm going to tell you just what you need to know. So, for a time, the Emperor led the Great Crusade himself. However, he needed to begin work on what was known to him as the Webway Project back on Earth. This bit of information had not been revealed to any of his Primarchs, a fact that would end up causing resentment to build up in many of his sons. Now, if the project had been successful, it would have completely eliminated humanity's reliance on warp travel. Unfortunately, that didn't end up happening, but I'm getting ahead of myself. So a new War Master was appointed to act in his stead. Horus Lupercal of the Luna Wolves was chosen for this role. Now, he was still a Primarch with his own legion, but for all intents and purposes, he would be the voice of the Emperor. Any decision that Horus made would be as if it came from the Emperor himself. Now, he had his faults, of course, just like the rest of his brothers. But when he was chosen as the War Master, even though a few Primarchs grumbled about how it should have been them, they all recognized Horus's greatness. And for a time, he served his role incredibly well. Now that would all change on the moon of Davin, when Horus was mortally injured by the planetary governor who had been corrupted by Nurgle, wielding a blade known as the Anathame, a sword that was said to be so deadly that it could kill even that which was unkillable. This wound placed Horus in a coma, and none of the apothecaries available on Horus's flagship, the Vengeful Spirit, were able to cure him. Now, to Horus's Marines at the time, this seemed like a freak accident. However, that's not exactly what happened. You see, there was this chaplain named Erebus, who was a member of the Wordbearers Legion and had been accompanying the Luna Wolves. You see, he had actually stolen the blade from a group of people known as the Interrex.
And all I ask is a... shot an arrow into the... I've lived through some terrible things. From the height of these pyramids, 40 centuries look down on us. There is nothing but a plank between a sailor and eternity. People who cannot find time for recreation are sooner or later to find time for illness.
It may behoove us to...
Ivrumu ayalum
it's natural to kill.
One man's magic
Divide and rule, a sound.
Completing the...
apprentices in a
There are very honest people.
After a loss in loyalty,
Invincibility lies in the defense, the possibility of victory in the attack.
If I were again beginning my... Everything has its limit. Iron ore cannot be educated into gold.
Gabriel Knight, too long. Now we're doing shitty horror games. Why not? Emma would like to please play.
Her name's Emily, you fool.
The spirit of it was correct. We begin the game as a pizza delivery man. So walk up to the door, knock knock, hello, I am Pizza Man.
Extra large Italian sausage. Quickly, the cheese is very hot.
The front door's wide open though. Oh, that's weird. So we enter the house for no fucking reason.
I worked as a pizza delivery man, and one of the first things they teach you is if you go to a house, the door's open.
You don't go in the fucking house.
You go in, you get what you can, get out.
Take my tip. I'm still going, pizza's here, pizza's here. The door has slammed behind us.
No.
And we see some creepy looking girl in a flash of lightning. Why doesn't he like immediately just try to get out? Well, I'll try the window, I'll try the back door. You wouldn't even think to be going through the rest of the house.
You work in a pizza place long enough, all the fumes